For nearly 4 decades, I've sat in this chair, hearing the stories of the downtrodden, the broken-hearted, and the forgotten. I've seen the best and worst of human nature, and in my years on the bench, I've come to understand that even the best people can make bad choices. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day a United States Senator walked into my courtroom and pointed a finger in my face, telling me I was finished. That morning was more than just a test of patience. It was a battle for the very soul of this city. And if you believe that justice is blind, whether you're living on a park bench or behind the walls of Capitol Hill, you need to hear this story. It was a cold November Tuesday, the kind of rain that soaks through to your bones. I walked into my courtroom at 8:55 a.m., shaking off the rain and the umbrella. Usually the room would hum with activity, lawyers talking, families huddled together, babies crying, but today the air was thick with silence. You could hear a pin drop. I looked at my clerk, Sarah. Her face was pale. She didn't even offer a greeting, just slid a docket across the desk with trembling hands and whispered, "Judge, look at the front row." I adjusted my glasses and looked up. In the front row sat a man who could have walked straight out of a magazine cover, dressed in a suit so expensive it might have cost more than my first car, with a diamond-studded American flag pin on his lapel, and 3 men in dark suits and earpieces standing guard behind him like a wall. It was Senator Julian Thorne, the kind of man who has the president on speed dial, and his glare could have frozen fire. I glanced down at the docket. The name on the case, William Thorne, age 24, the senator's son. The charges were ugly: aggravated assault, destruction of public property, fleeing the scene of an accident. According to the report, William had stolen his father's $200,000 sports car, crashed it into a school playground fence, and then beaten a teacher who tried to stop him. I looked over at the defendant's table. William Thorne sat there chewing gum, nonchalantly inspecting his fingernails, looking like he was at a spa, not facing jail time. His team of high-priced lawyers stood behind him like sharks circling their prey. I banged my gavel to begin the session. The case of the City of Providence versus William Thorne. Before the prosecutor could even rise, Senator Thorne stood, uninvited, striding through the gate into the well of the courtroom, where only defendants and attorneys are allowed. "Excuse me, sir," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "Please take a seat behind the bar." The senator laughed, a cold, dry laugh. "Frank, let's cut the theater. We both know why I'm here. I'm here to make sure you don't make a mistake that will cost you your pension." The courtroom gasped. My bailiff, Quinn, moved toward his belt, but I stopped him with a gesture. This was something I needed to hear. I met Thorne's eyes, my voice calm, despite the storm inside me. "In this room, you are not a senator. You are a member of the public, and if you disrupt these proceedings again, I will have you removed." Thorne sneered. "Removed? Frank, I appoint federal judges. I decide who gets funding for this crumbling courthouse. You don't remove me, I remove you." I looked at him, and in that moment, I didn't see a powerful politician. I saw a bully. It reminded me of the old days, when kids would steal your lunch money because no one would stop them. But this wasn't a playground. I leaned into the microphone, my voice low and steady. "Senator, you may decide who gets funding, but in this room you don't decide what justice looks like. Now sit down, or I will have you placed in a holding cell for contempt." He turned bright red, veins bulging in his neck. But after what seemed like an eternity, he finally turned and sat down, still seething. But he wasn't defeated. He was plotting his next move. The prosecutor, Elena Rodriguez, a young woman who'd been practicing law for only 6 months, stood up, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, on the afternoon of November 14th, the defendant, William Thorne, was speeding through a school zone in a 2024 McLaren. There were children everywhere. Mr. Henderson, a teacher, saw the car coming and tried to stop him." She paused, looking back at the gallery. "But when Mr. Henderson tried to stop him, the defendant got out of the car and attacked him. He punched a 62-year-old teacher in the face, knocking him to the ground, and continued kicking him while shouting, 'Do you know who my father is?'" I glanced over at the defendant. William didn't even flinch. He smirked, rolling his eyes as if the whole thing was a joke. I looked back at Elena, my voice hard. "Is Mr. Henderson here today?" She nodded, and the teacher, still bruised and battered, stood slowly, leaning on a cane. His pain was visible in every step. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "please come to the microphone." The old teacher limped to the podium, his cane tapping the floor like a ticking clock. It was the sound of reality setting in, but before he could speak, one of the defense lawyers jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, he said. This is a spectacle. The senator has already offered to pay for the medical bills and the damages. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. I turned to the lawyer and then to William, who was checking his watch. A political stunt? I asked, my voice unwavering. A man was beaten because he tried to protect children. That's not politics. That's a crime. Then from the back of the room, the senator spoke again. It's a shakedown, Frank. How much does the teacher want? 10,000? 20,000? Let's get this over with. Mr. Henderson's shoulders slumped, and he whispered into the microphone. I don't want money. I just wanted him to say sorry. And then something shifted in the air. It wasn't the anger, it was the heartbreak. A man who had spent his life teaching kids was reduced to a nuisance in the eyes of the rich and powerful. Before I could respond, the doors to the back of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark suits entered, heading straight for Elena, handing her a phone. It's for you, one of them said. Elena took the phone and listened for a few moments before her face went white. She lowered the phone, her voice trembling as she spoke. Your Honor, the state wishes to drop all charges. The senator leaned back in his seat, a smug smile crossing his face. He was victorious, or so he thought, but I wasn't done. I leaned forward, tapping the gavel. The room was dead silent, and I let the weight of the moment settle before I spoke again. Drop the charges? I repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. They hung in the air like smoke. Miss Rodriguez, are you sure about this? The prosecutor, Elena, stood there frozen for a moment before she nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew exactly what had happened. The powerful forces at play in that courtroom were not interested in truth or justice. They only cared about protecting their own. We have no choice, Your Honor, she whispered, barely audible. I turned to face Senator Thorne, who was still lounging in his seat like he owned the room. His arrogance was palpable, but beneath it I could see the fear. He knew that his victory wasn't secure yet, but I wasn't going to let him win that easily. Senator Thorne, I said with cold resolve, you might think that your power and wealth can shield you from accountability, but in this room, in this court, the law is the only thing that matters. And I will not let you take it down with a single phone call. The senator's face reddened. You don't have the authority to do this, he sneered. The charges are dropped. You've lost. I let his words linger for a moment, but I was ready. I wasn't done. The room was charged with a palpable sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew this moment would determine the fate of the entire case. I turned to the side and nodded at Sarah, my clerk. Sarah, if you would be so kind. She slid a USB drive into the court system, and the large monitors around the room flickered to life. The entire courtroom fell silent, and for the first time that morning, all eyes turned to the screen. The footage was clear, painfully so. The video from the school's playground security cameras showed everything. The silver McLaren tearing through the schoolyard, nearly plowing through the fence, narrowly missing a group of children. It was a miracle no one was seriously injured. The crowd watched as William Thorne got out of the car, his arrogance still on display, inspecting the bumper like it was the most important thing in the world. But the moment Mr. Henderson appeared on screen, trying to check on the children's safety, everything changed. The footage was brutal. You could hear William shouting at Mr. Henderson about his paint job, and then without any provocation, William struck him again and again, kicking him while the man was helpless on the ground. The courtroom was dead silent as the video continued to play, but when William spit on Mr. Henderson's bleeding form and taunted him with the words, "Call the cops, go ahead, my dad owns this town," the gasp in the courtroom was collective. The video ended. The room stayed frozen. The tension was thick. But it was clear, the case wasn't just about a rich kid throwing his weight around anymore. It was about a man using his power to cover up a crime. Senator Thorne's face turned ghostly pale, and for the first time that morning, I saw real fear in his eyes. The arrogant smirk he had worn so proudly was gone, replaced by an expression of pure panic. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Elena said, her voice breaking. "The state withdraws its motion to dismiss." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch on. The battle had just taken a major turn in our favor, but it wasn't over yet. "Now let's talk about bail," I said, my voice steady but firm. The senator stood again, regaining some composure, though his eyes remained wild. "Bail? Are you seriously denying bail for my son?" he demanded. "This is absurd." I opened the bail guidelines book and slowly flipped through the pages. For a first-time offense involving assault, bail is typically set at $5,000, I said, as if stating a simple fact. The senator's pen hovered over his checkbook, his fingers twitching as he waited for me to name the sum, but I wasn't done. I'm looking at the flight risk factors here, I said, the room hanging on every word. I see a family with private jets, unlimited funds, and a documented attempt to intimidate witnesses. So, Senator, what I'm saying is put your checkbook away. Bail is denied. Your son is being remanded into the custody of the sheriff's department until trial. William's face went white, and for the first time that day I saw a flicker of true fear in him. No, he screamed, his voice cracking. You can't do this. My dad will fix this. He always fixes everything. The senator, his face contorted in rage, turned to his lawyers, pleading with them to do something, anything, to get his son out of this. But it was too late. I had made my decision. I turned to Officer Quinn. Take him into custody, I ordered, and Quinn stepped forward, ready to escort William out of the courtroom. But as Quinn reached for William, the senator's bodyguards sprang into action. They stepped between Quinn and the defendant, blocking his path. The room held its breath, and for a moment it felt as though the entire situation could explode into chaos. Don't touch him, one of the bodyguards growled, his hand hovering over his holster. I stood up, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Officer Quinn, if those men don't move in 3 seconds, arrest them too. Obstruction of justice. The room went quiet again. Everyone could feel the storm brewing. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed like the courthouse might become the scene of something much darker. But the senator knew better. He saw the camera, the reporters, the world watching, and with a growl he barked, "Stand down!" The bodyguards stepped aside, though their glares were enough to burn through steel. Quinn moved forward without hesitation, handcuffing William with swift authority. As the young man screamed and struggled, the sound of the handcuffs snapping shut was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of a life being forever altered. As Quinn led William Thorne away, his voice echoing through the courtroom as he shouted threats, the tension in the room was palpable. The doors slammed behind him, and silence enveloped the space. But it wasn't a victorious silence. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, heavy, unsettling. I turned back to the gallery. The people in the room, the ones who had been cheering earlier, were now motionless. They weren't clapping anymore. They weren't shouting. They were waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't sure. But I knew what needed to be done next. The moment I walked through that door, the room stood up. Every single person in the gallery rose to their feet. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Some had smiles of triumph. Mr. Henderson was still sitting in the front row, his cane resting at his side. His face, though bruised and battered, wore a look of relief. I nodded in his direction. "Mr. Henderson," I called. He stood slowly, his cane clicking on the floor as he made his way to the center of the room. He wasn't tall, but in that moment he carried himself with a dignity that was hard to ignore. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. I smiled softly. "You are seen, Mr. Henderson. You are heard." The weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air, but it was also a moment of redemption. A man who had been battered not only physically but emotionally had been given the respect he deserved. I turned back to my desk and picked up the file. It was time to address the next matter of business. "Bring out the defendant," I ordered, my voice steady, despite the exhaustion beginning to creep in. This wasn't over yet. The side door opened, and Officer Quinn led William Thorne back into the courtroom. Gone was the swagger, the smirk, the sense of entitlement. Now he was just a kid. Pale, wrinkled suit, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot and wide with fear. He looked around frantically. "Where's my dad?" he asked, his voice shaking. "He promised he would fix this. Where is he?" The room didn't laugh. No one took joy in the boy's desperation. The silence was thick with pity. Pity for a young man whose life had been built on a lie that his father's wealth and influence could protect him from the consequences of his actions. "William," I said softly, leaning forward. He looked up at me, his lips trembling, his hands clutching the edge of the defendant's table. "Your father is not coming back." "What do you mean?" he whispered. "Your father," I said slowly, letting the words sink in, "has been arrested. He is on his way to a federal detention center." William's knees buckled, and Officer Quinn, ever steady, caught him before he fell. The sound of his sobs filled the room. The tears were not the tears of someone who was sorry. They were the tears of someone who had been caught, who had lost the safety net he had always known. "No, this isn't fair," William wailed, his voice raw with fear and disbelief. "I didn't do anything. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was just an accident." I let him cry for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to crash down on him. When the sobs quieted, I spoke again. "William, you say it isn't fair," I began, my voice firm but not unkind. "Let me tell you what isn't fair. It's not fair that Mr. Henderson, an educator, a man who has dedicated his life to teaching children, has to suffer because of your actions. It's not fair that children in that playground had to watch as a car crashed through their fence. And it's not fair that you've spent your entire life believing that your last name could protect you from the consequences of your actions." I stood up and walked toward him, my gaze unwavering. "I have read your record, William. This is not the first time you've used your family's name to avoid accountability. You've had speeding tickets swept under the rug. You've had charges vanish. But today, your bubble has burst. Today, you face reality." He wiped his nose with his sleeve, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "You're sorry because you got caught. You're not sorry for what you've done. You're not sorry because of the pain you caused. That is not remorse. That is fear." I turned to the prosecutor, Elena, who had returned to her seat, standing a little taller now, no longer trembling with the weight of the injustice that had almost been allowed to pass. "Miss Rodriguez," I said, my voice clear, "does the state still wish to drop the charges?" She stood tall, looking me straight in the eye. "No, Your Honor," she said with newfound confidence. "The state requests that bail remain denied. We are also adding a charge of attempted bribery and filing a motion to seize the defendant's passport." "Granted," I replied, not missing a beat. William's eyes went wide. He started to speak, but his words were lost in a torrent of panic. "No, please, you can't keep me here. Do you know what they'll do to me in there?" I looked at him calmly. "I know exactly what happens in jail. It's a place where your name doesn't matter. It's a place where the only thing that matters is who you are as a person, not who you know. And for the first time in your life, you're going to be treated just like everyone else. It might be the best thing that ever happens to you." I signed the order with a deliberate stroke of the pen. The sound of it was final. The gavel came down, but it didn't ring with triumph. It wasn't a victory. It was a lesson that no one is above the law. Officer Quinn moved to take William away. He screamed and struggled, but there was nothing left for him. The doors slammed behind him, and the courtroom was silent once more. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the day sinking in. But even as the door clicked shut, I knew one thing. The scales of justice had balanced today, and as long as I was still here, I would continue to hold that balance, no matter the cost. As the doors to the courtroom closed behind William Thorne, the silence that enveloped the room was deafening. The finality of the moment hit harder than I had anticipated. There would be no more gavel bangs, no more back and forth between the defense and the prosecution. This case, this trial of the powerful versus the powerless, was over. But the impact of what had just occurred would ripple through the city and beyond, shaking up a system that had been too willing to let the rich and powerful escape consequence. I looked at the faces in the gallery, the people who had witnessed the entire ordeal, the teachers, the nurses, the veterans, many of whom had likely never seen the kind of justice I had just served. They were all still standing as if unsure whether they had the right to sit down. Then, as if the collective tension was broken by some invisible force, the room erupted. People began to clap. It wasn't a celebration, not in the traditional sense. There were no cheers, no loud shouts. It was more like a release, like a deep breath after holding it in for too long. But amidst the clapping, I noticed Mr. Henderson standing up again. He had never been the loudest voice in the room, but he didn't need to be. The way he walked with his cane, the way he held his head a little higher, he had been seen. The people around him didn't just see a teacher who had been hurt. They saw someone who had stood up, not just for himself, but for the children he had protected, for the right to live in a just world. "Thank you," he said quietly as he looked at me from across the room, his voice hoarse but filled with genuine gratitude. "You are welcome, Mr. Henderson," I replied, my voice soft, "and you are heard." With that, the applause faded, and the courtroom slowly returned to a quieter atmosphere. The emotional weight was still there, but it was different now. It was the weight of justice served, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger movement. A movement of people who weren't going to stand idly by anymore while the powerful got away with everything. I called the next case, trying to settle back into the routine of court life, but something felt different. I wasn't the same judge who had walked into that courtroom that morning. The events of the day had changed me. Not just the outcome of the case, but the realization that justice isn't something you just uphold. It's something you fight for, every single day. The trial was over, but it was only the beginning of the consequences. For the Thorne family, for the city, for me. The news spread quickly. By the time I left the courthouse that evening, I could already feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. And it wasn't just the weight of the Thorne family's threat or the political ramifications of what had happened. It was the feeling that this wasn't a battle I'd fought alone. This was a collective victory. The people of Providence, teachers, families, citizens, had all witnessed the truth of what had happened. The footage of Senator Thorne's arrest quickly went viral. It was broadcast on every news channel, CNN, Fox News, BBC. The once untouchable politician, who had been so certain of his invincibility, was now the laughingstock of the nation. His arrogance and entitlement had made him a target, but it wasn't just about him. The story had become a symbol for something larger, a symbol of the strength of the everyday person when they are given the chance to fight back. Back in my office, I found myself staring at the phone, waiting for the next call. It came soon enough. The governor was on the line. "Frank," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his words, "I've seen the news. I know what happened in that courtroom today. And I need you to understand something." His voice lowered. "You did the right thing." I didn't know how to respond. The governor and I had a long history, but in that moment, the weight of his words felt different, genuine. "I didn't do it alone," I replied quietly. "The people did." I could hear him nod on the other end. "You're right. The people." He paused before speaking again. "But you're also right about something else. The battle isn't over. There will be more obstacles ahead. More people with power, more people with money, trying to shift the narrative, trying to protect their own. Then we keep fighting," I said, my voice resolute. "You're damn right we do," the governor replied. "I'll be in touch, Frank. Take care." I hung up, the weight of the conversation settling deep into my chest. It was far from over. The senator might have been brought down, but there were still plenty of others who would continue to play the game, using their power and wealth to influence the system. But now, there were cracks in that system. There were cracks that people could see, and maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so easy for them to fill them in. As I stood up from my desk, I glanced at the framed photograph of my father on the wall. It had always been there, a quiet reminder of the values I was supposed to uphold. Today, though, it felt different, like the weight of those values had never been heavier. But it also felt like a triumph. My father used to tell me that justice wasn't about winning, it was about balance. And today, the scales had been tipped back into balance, even if only for a moment. The next day, the headlines told the story in bold letters. Senator Thorne arrested on charges of corruption. Arrest warrant issued for his son. The city was abuzz with the news, but it wasn't just about the Thornes. It was about the ripple effect, the realization that no one was truly untouchable. Even the most powerful had to face the consequences when their actions crossed the line. And the best part, people were starting to believe that justice still had a place in this world. And maybe, just maybe, it was something worth fighting for. The investigation into Senator Thorne and his corrupt practices had only just begun, but what the FBI uncovered was a trail of corruption so deep and so widespread that it rattled the foundations of the political world. From bribed judges to rigged contracts, Senator Thorne's empire of power began to crumble, piece by piece. His son William, though still living under the shadow of his father's legacy, had been sentenced to serve 3 years in state prison. But more importantly, he had been ordered to work for the public, spending 500 hours maintaining and repairing public playgrounds. A fitting punishment, I thought, for someone who had so callously destroyed what others held dear. And then there was Mr. Henderson, the teacher whose life had been turned upside down by a senseless act of violence. The world rallied behind him, raising over $300,000 through crowdfunding efforts. But even more than that, people wrote him letters of support, thanking him for his bravery and dedication to his students. It was something he cherished far more than the money. And Elena Rodriguez? She had quit the district attorney's office the day after the trial, shaken by the realization that the system she had trusted was deeply flawed. But she didn't walk away. Instead, she ran for city council, vowing to reform the system from the inside. She won in a landslide, and today she's one of the fiercest advocates for justice in this city. The story of that courtroom, the story of a senator's downfall, and the story of a teacher's triumph would be told for years to come. But it wasn't just the outcome that mattered. It was the message that in this world, no one is above the law. Not a senator, not a millionaire, not even someone with a father who could buy the police station. If you hurt the people, if you trample on the lives of others, there are consequences. And in the end, that's what matters. As for me, I'm still sitting here, still listening to speeding ticket cases, to parking violations, still standing up to the bullies, still ensuring that justice is served one case at a time. Because as my father always said, it's not about the big cases, it's about the little ones. It's about making sure that every person, no matter who they are, has a chance at a fair shake. And as long as I'm here, that's what I'll keep doing.